Tonight we step into the calm, quiet shadows of New York, following the life of Sammy the Bull Gravano from street corners to Underboss and beyond. As you listen, feel free to share your time and location in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see where and when you are joining us from. Chapter 1: Bensonhurst Nights. The kid they called Sammy liked the sound of shoes on cracked Brooklyn sidewalks more than the sound of teachers on blackboards. On summer nights, the whole block felt like a giant living room with no ceiling. Windows were open, voices floated out with the smell of garlic and frying oil, radios hummed a little too loud. Somewhere a baby cried. Somewhere an uncle laughed at his own joke for the 10th time. Inside the Gravano apartment there were too many people for the space, and not enough chairs for the people. Cousins and aunties and neighbours drifted through like tidewater. Conversations overlapped. Grown-ups talked about rent, about shortages, about some cousin back in the old country who was still waiting for a visa. The stories were always half complaint and half pride. Sammy listened from the doorway, his back on the frame, just far enough away that the adults sometimes forgot he was there. He liked the rhythm of it more than the content. The way voices rose and fell, the meaningful silences. The way when name could change the entire mood of the room. A name would drop, and all at once the air got heavier, the ashtrays got busier, and everyone chose their words more carefully. He did not know the details then. He only understood that there were certain men in Bensonhurst who made landlords nervous and made grocery bills magically easier to pay. Men who were respected, feared, or both, depending on the witness. Outside, the street offered a different kind of classroom. Boys his age leaned against parked cars and pretended they were not waiting for someone to notice them. They would kick at loose stones, trade small gossip, flick bottle caps at the curb. Nothing important, they would say. Yet it felt important. Every glance mattered. Every nod meant something. Sammy was smaller than many of them, but he had a stare that lasted a little longer than most. He watched how the older boys stood, how they laughed, how they never turned their back fully to anyone. He studied the way they held their cigarettes, the way they shook hands. He was not sure why he was studying, only that he could not help it. At school, his teachers used words like troubled and difficult. They said his attention wandered. They did not understand that his attention was actually precise. It was simply focused on exits, on faces, on the small gestures that other kids missed. The classroom felt too tight, the windows too high, the rules too fragile. On a grey morning, a guidance counsellor sat him down and tried to explain that if he did not calm down, he would end up in a special place for boys who could not behave. The counsellor meant it as a warning. To Sammy, it sounded almost interesting. A place full of kids like him. Imagine that. The fights came easily. Kids made jokes, he reacted, and then everyone pretended to be surprised. He was quick to defend himself, quicker to defend a friend, and never happy to walk away from disrespect. Something in him refused to back down once a line had been drawn. The adults finally followed through on their warning. The so-called school for incorrigibles was not really a school in the way people think of schools. It was a collection of buildings with long hallways and locked doors. The teachers looked tired before the first bell even rang. The boys looked older than their ages, veterans of small wars fought on stoops and in alleys. Sammy walked those halls with his chin tilted just high enough to say, "I am not impressed." Inside, though, he studied harder than ever. Note the textbooks, but the people. He noticed who barked the loudest and who actually got things done. He saw how fear worked, how it could be used, how it could be resisted. In a strange way, that rough school felt more honest than his old one. Nobody pretended things were fine, nobody acted shocked when a boy snapped. Rules were clear, even if they were not written anywhere. Still, the label stuck to him like a shadow. Incorrigible. A kid who could not be corrected. When he finally came back to the neighbourhood full-time, Bensonhurst seemed both the same and different. The candy store was still on the corner, the bakery still gave away slightly burnt cookies at the end of the day, but now he saw invisible lines running through every block. This bar belonged to those guys. that social club to another group. This guy paid respect to that guy, and when that guy walked by, everyone at the cafe straightened in their chairs without even realizing it. The real education, he realized, was happening out here. He ran errands for shop owners and older kids. Take the envelope over there, bring back a receipt. Nothing earth-shattering, just small favors. But the people who asked him watched closely. Did he open the envelope? Was he late? Did he forget anything? He did not open envelopes. He arrived on time. He remembered everything. Those small tasks bought him something he craved more than candy or games. They bought him a reputation. The word dependable started to follow his name in certain mouths. So did tough, which was flattering, and crazy, which he thought was a little unfair but sometimes useful. Late at night, when the brownstones went dark and the streetlights hummed to themselves, he would sit on a stoot and look up at the narrow slice of sky. Somewhere above, planes crossed and stars glowed a little too faintly through the city haze. He wondered, briefly, what life looked like far away from Brooklyn. Then a car rolled slowly down the block, a familiar face nodded through the window, and the thought floated off like smoke. The neighborhood tugged at him. It said, "Stay." It said, "You belong here." His family did not know what to do with him. His mother worried. His father, a hard-working man, tried to steer him toward honest labor. They argued in that quiet way parents do when they are afraid of saying the wrong thing out loud. They wanted him safe. They wanted him different. They also knew he was stubborn to the bone. Sometimes his father would take him along to work, just to keep him off the corner. On those days, Sammy felt the pull of another possible future, the kind that involved alarm clocks and paychecks and aching feet. But the streets called louder. He learned to move between those worlds, home and outside, like a kid walking a narrow fence. In the coffee shops, men played cards and spoke in code. They mentioned shipments and projects and unions, but rarely said exactly what they meant. Still, the meanings were obvious enough. If someone asked about a man who had caused trouble, the shoulders would lift, the palms would spread, and someone would say, "Who knows where he went?" in a tone that said everyone knew exactly what had happened. Sammy absorbed it. This was a system. It had rules, clear and unfair in equal measure. It rewarded certain behaviors and punished others swiftly. On one particularly warm night, the air heavy and slow, he walked home alone after a long stretch at the corner. The block was quiet, just the sound of a distant train and a radio murmuring from a window 2 floors up. He passed a small social club tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered store. The door was half open. Smoke drifted out. Inside, men sat around a table, leaning close, their voices low but intense. No one inside the club moved like an ordinary customer. They moved like people who were used to being observed and respected. One of them looked up and met his eyes for a brief second. It was not a friendly look, not hostile either. It was an appraisal, an adult measuring a boy and filing the result away. He kept walking, heartbeat a little quicker, not out of fear, but out of a strange certainty. He knew, without knowing how he knew, that his life would keep intersecting with rooms like that, doors half open, voices low, decisions heavier than the night air. At the corner he paused and looked back. The club door had closed. The block was just a block again. Laundry lines, parked cars, a flickering streetlight. Nothing special if you did not know where to look. He whispered, more to himself than to anyone else, that he belonged to this place, whether it was a blessing or a curse. For a kid labelled impossible to correct, it was the first real sense of belonging. Chapter 2. From Street Corner to Serious Business. By the time Sammy was a young man, the corners that had once felt like a universe began to feel small, like waiting rooms for something larger. He had learned how to stand, how to keep his back near a wall, how to watch the reflection in a storefront window rather than staring openly at someone behind him. He had collected old scars and new stories, and he had outgrown the role of errand boy. The older guys had noticed. Work changed shape. No more simple deliveries. Now it was introductions. A quiet nod toward a man at the back table, a suggestion that Sammy might be useful on a certain job or that he might be ready to handle a certain situation. He stepped into those invitations carefully, one after another. He helped with small protection schemes that began with conversation and only threatened trouble if someone refused to listen. He spent long evenings in bars where nobody came just for the drinks. The money grew a little thicker, the favors a little heavier. For all his restless energy, he had discipline when it counted. If a plan was set, he followed it. If a meeting time was agreed, he was there early. If an older man in the life gave an order, he completed it without unnecessary flair. These things mattered more than bravado. Around the same time, the wider world briefly claimed him. The draft swept him into the army, a universe of uniforms and shouted commands. For a kid from Bensonhurst, it was a strange kind of vacation. There were new accents, new rules, new ways to stand in line. The discipline did not scare him. He knew how to take orders. The travel intrigued him for a while, seeing parts of the country that did not smell like the ocean and exhaust. Yet even there, in barracks and on bases, he found the same quiet hierarchy of respect and fear, just with different symbols on the sleeves. When he returned home, he carried himself with a little more confidence, shoulders squared, steps measured, but the core of him had not changed. He still felt most at ease on his home block, among people who knew his family name, his childhood fights, and his stubborn streak. The neighborhood had evolved in his absence. Some faces were gone, moved away, or quietly unalived in ways nobody discussed directly. New crews were gaining influence. The local landscape of power had been rearranged, and so had the links between families in the city. Sammy found that his own stock had risen. People saw a man now, not the troubled kid who had been sent off to the tough school. He had proven he could handle himself in different environments. He had a knack for dealing with blue-collar guys, with union members, with small business owners who were tired of being squeezed by everyone except the people who promised to protect them. Construction sites became his new classroom. Out on the edges of Brooklyn and Staten Island, skeletons of new buildings reached toward the sky, surrounded by mud and noise. Here, concrete and rebar mixed with whispers about contracts and bids, which company got which job, which union backed which crew, which inspector could be persuaded to ask fewer questions. Sammy moved through these places with an easy energy. He spoke the language of workers, joking about long days and sore backs. He also spoke the quieter language of bosses, the woeful of hints and half-sentences. He saw how money flowed through construction. He saw how a delay here, a minor accident there, a slow shipment somewhere else, could all be turned into leverage for the right people. In this world, his value grew. He could deliver crews who showed up on time. He could make sure certain jobs went to certain companies. He could smooth over arguments before they turned into strikes. He also understood the street, which gave him a reputation as someone who could collect on debts without leaving visible bruises on the situation. For a while, he was linked to figures around the Colombo family. Those relationships were built on earned trust, long nights, and shared risk. But he was never the type to float aimlessly between banners. Loyalty mattered to him, and he wanted a clear structure. The Gambino family loomed large over the borough, its influence woven into docks, trucking, construction, and more. Their people walked with a certain gravity. When they entered a cafe, conversation shifted almost imperceptibly. It was power, understated but unmistakable. Through business on job sites and introductions in back rooms, Sammy drifted closer to that orbit. It did not happen in a single dramatic moment. There was no grand ceremony in his story at that point, just a series of small steps. Someone vouched for him at a meeting. Someone else took note of how well a certain job had gone under his watch. A problem in a yard or on a contract vanished quietly after he got involved. There was also the matter of temperament. He had the reputation of a man who did not scare easily, and who did not hesitate when a firm decision had to be made. Yet he was not reckless. In a world full of loud talkers, he tended to let others brag while he weighed the angles. This mix made him stand out. In small social clubs and larger gatherings, he listened while others argued about strategy. Should they push harder on this union? Should they let that business simmer a while longer? Where was the line between ambition and unnecessary heat from law enforcement? He did not speak often, but when he did, his words showed that he had studied the neighborhood like a map. He knew which path would cause trouble, which would smooth things over, which would bring in steady income without attracting headlines. The men above him noticed. Of course, the life was not all calm calculations and careful deals. Every so often there were crises. Someone skimmed money they were not supposed to skim. Someone talked too freely. A minor player made a major mistake and put everyone at risk. On those nights, the tension grew thick as cigarette smoke. Punishments were decided behind closed doors. Names were erased from ledgers. Stories ended abruptly. When people asked where a certain man had gone, the answer drifted out in tired phrases. He took a trip. He moved out of town. He is no longer with us. Sammy understood what those words meant. He also understood that by staying in this life, he accepted those rules. You did not climb the ladder without getting your hands spiritually dirty, even if the details were never spoken out loud. The heavy parts of this work stayed mostly in the shadows of his thoughts, pushed aside by the practical tasks of each day. There were meetings with union representatives, quietly guided by invisible interests. There were negotiations with business owners who needed loans or protection. Sometimes, after a long day of back and forth, the air would soften. He would sit with his crew in a corner booth, plates scraped clean, espresso cups clinking on saucers. Jokes would fly. One guy needed to talk about his mother-in-law, another about his endless issues with a car that would not start in winter. They compared notes on which bakery had the best cannoli, and they argued about baseball with more passion than they put into some business deals. These human moments gave the life a strange warmth. You could almost forget that the same table might host very serious decisions tomorrow. For tonight, they were just men teasing each other, complaining about the cost of living, worrying about kids and mortgages and aching knees. Sammy was not immune to that softer side. He had his own family, a wife, children. At home, he tried to leave his work at the door, at least in the obvious ways. He was a father first, a husband, a man who paid attention to schoolwork and chores, and who tried, however imperfectly, to shield his loved ones from the darker edges of his professional world. But the life seeped in at the edges. Phone calls came late at night. Meetings popped up at inconvenient times. There were unspoken tensions when he had to leave family dinners early, or when he came home with a clouded look in his eyes. He told himself that every sacrifice was for them, that the money, the security, the respect, it all translated into a better life for his family. That belief made it easier to walk into the next social club, the next back room, the next conversation whose stakes were higher than the casual tone suggested. Gradually, he settled into a role not just as a soldier, but as a leader. Younger men looked to him for cues. They watched how he handled slights, how he answered disrespect, how he negotiated peace between hot-headed guys who would otherwise turn a small dispute into a street-wide drama. He found himself speaking for others, representing them in meetings with higher-ranking members of the family. When money was discussed, his numbers were solid. When territory was debated, his arguments rested on hours spent walking those very streets, talking to the people who lived and worked there. The path he was on narrowed with each success. He could no longer simply walk away without leaving pieces of himself behind. His name was attached to crews, to deals, to promises. The higher he climbed, the more his choices shaped the lives of others. On a cool evening, years after that first time a club door had swung open in front of a teenage boy, he found himself strolling down a familiar block with two trusted men at his side. The sidewalks felt the same. The buildings still leaned in toward the street, listening. Yet he knew something had fundamentally changed. He was no longer looking in from the outside. If a younger kid glanced toward them from a stoop, that kid saw what Sammy had once seen: an entire world compacted into a few men in expensive shoes and quiet suits. He paused for a moment at the edge of the block and looked back, feeling a small twist in his chest. He thought of his father, and his hopes for an honest path. He thought of his mother lighting candles and praying in whispered Italian. He thought of teachers who had declared him impossible to correct, and of the men in the life who had declared him dependable. Somewhere between those verdicts he had built a strange kind of identity. He took a breath, squared his shoulders and kept walking toward the future the streets had been steering him toward all along, the future that would eventually carry him into the highest levels of a powerful family. For now, though, he was still just a respected soldier, a rising figure in Brooklyn, a man whose name meant something in both construction yards and quiet, smoke-filled rooms. The storm clouds above the family were already gathering, though he did not yet see their full shape. The moves that would change bosses and rewrite histories were still being whispered about in coded language at late-night tables. He would soon find himself not merely a witness to that shift, but an active part of it. But on this night, the sound of his own footsteps on familiar pavement was almost soothing. The city hummed with distant traffic, and the neon from a bar sign painted a gentle glow on the wet street. Sammy the Bull Gravano walked into the darkness ahead, not yet knowing how bright the spotlight would someday become. Chapter 3: Building a Crew in Brooklyn. By the time Sammy was trusted with his own crew, Brooklyn felt like a board where every block was a piece and every piece had history. The social club that became his unofficial headquarters was not much to look at from the outside. A narrow door with peeling paint, a dusty window that never showed too much. If you did not know, you might walk by 100 times and never give it a thought. Inside, though, the air held stories. There were card tables scarred by 1,000 games, a coffee machine that groaned like an old singer every morning, posters on the walls that had faded into soft memories of long-forgotten festivals and fights. Men sat in chairs that had molded themselves to familiar backs. Sammy moved through the room with the quiet assurance of someone who knew every squeak in the floor. He was not the loudest voice or the biggest man, but when he walked in, conversations took a small breath. People registered that the man they answered to was now present. His crew was a mix of personalities. There was the calm one who never raised his voice and never missed a payment. There was the anxious kid who talked too fast but had a good heart and a better memory. There was the older guy who complained about everything yet showed up early for every job. A handful of others rotated through, some steady, some temporary, some destined to drift away in one direction or another. They argued about sports and food and music as much as they talked business. It was a strange comfort. One minute they were debating which bakery had the best bread. The next, they were discussing which contractor needed a reminder about his obligation. On certain mornings the club would wake up slowly. Men shuffled in, half asleep, jackets thrown over shoulders, scarves wound around necks to guard against the cold wind off the harbour. The coffee was strong enough to straighten a spine. Newspapers were spread out on tables, headlines about mayors and strikes and scandals. Sammy would skim the pages, but his real news came from the mouths around him. Who had seen federal agents asking question? Which union delegate looked nervous? Which bar owner had been hanging around the wrong company? He was building more than a crew, he was building an information network. The construction business gave him a steady rhythm. He would visit sites where steel beams reached into the sky, where men in hard hats shouted over the roar of machinery. Mud clung to boots, cement dust floated in the air like slow snow. On the surface it was ordinary blue-collar chaos. Beneath that surface money flowed in channels only certain people could see. Sammy understood which company really controlled a job, even if the paperwork said otherwise. He knew which union foreman would listen to reason and which needed firmer persuasion. He could tell when a delay was honest and when it was being used as leverage. He brought discipline to the table. He expected his men to show up on time, to follow instructions, to keep mouths closed. No wild stories in bars, no bragging to girlfriends about connections, no loose-talking cars that might carry unwanted microphones. In return, he provided something rare in that world: stability. People knew that if they were under his umbrella and followed the rules, they were safer than they might be otherwise. Problems got smoothed over. Debts were renegotiated rather than turning into disasters. Hot heads were cooled before they lit fires that could not be put out. Of course, not everyone liked discipline. There were always men who thought shortcut meant smart move. They skimmed from envelopes. They treated the life like a game instead of a profession. They confused loudness with strength. Those men tended to learn lessons the hard way. When someone in his circle crossed a serious line, Sammy felt the weight of his role. He had climbed far enough to know that his decisions carried consequences that did not stop at one man. Families were involved. Children were involved. The quiet lives around the edges always felt the shockwaves. There were nights when he sat in the back of the club with only one or two trusted guys, the rest of the place empty, the ashtrays overflowing. A decision hung in the air like a storm cloud. Someone had betrayed trust or threatened stability. The options were limited and none of them gentle. The life had rules, and those rules demanded that certain people be removed from the picture. They were unalived in ways that were never discussed in detail, not in public, not even in private. The language of it stayed dry and distant. We took care of it. He is gone. He is not a problem anymore. Behind those phrases there were real people. Sammy knew that too well. One day the man who had crossed a line was not some distant associate, but someone tied to him by family. Bad choices, repeated warnings, debts and disrespect had piled up until there was no room left to maneuver. The decision was made in that back room, the air thick and still. Sammy agreed to it because he saw no other way to protect the structure that he had helped build. It was the hardest call of his life, and once he made it, there was no turning back. He did not tell the full story to his wife. He did not explain it to his children. He carried it quietly, like a stone in his pocket that he could never put down. After events like that, he would walk the old Brooklyn streets alone at night. He would pass brownstones where kids slept in bunk beds, oblivious to the fact that their neighborhood was held together by invisible contracts. He would listen to the distant hum of the elevated train, the occasional siren, the soft argument of a couple 3 floors up. The city went on. The coffee shops opened in the morning, the bakery put fresh bread in the window. The world did not pause for his private storms, so he went back to work. His worth to the Gambino family continued to grow. He was a reliable earner. Construction deals flourished. The unions he touched became smoother for the family to handle. His crew brought in steady money without unnecessary public incidents. That combination of income and control drew attention from higher up. He found himself invited to more important meetings, sitting at tables with men whose names carried weight across the entire city. Some had classic old-world manners, kissing cheeks and making formal greetings. Others had a more modern swagger, rings flashing under the dim light, jokes landing with a harder edge. Sammy sat among them, absorbing the dynamics. He saw who truly commanded respect and who was simply tolerated. He watched how decisions were made, who deferred, who made last-minute adjustments. The life at that level was part chess match and part family dinner. It was during these years that his path crossed more deeply with figures like Paul Castellano, the boss, and John Gotti, a captain whose style was impossible to ignore. At first he was another capable man in a large organization, but as his successes piled up, his name was mentioned in conversations he was not present for. Captains and higher-ups debated where best to place him. There were disagreements about how fast-rising men should be promoted, about how much responsibility a person could carry without risking envy and backlash. Through it all, he kept his head steady and his focus on work. He made sure his crew had what they needed. He listened to their complaints and their jokes. He kept their problems from floating up the ladder, knowing that higher-ups preferred results to excuses. He also kept an eye on the larger picture. The city was changing. Law enforcement strategies were shifting. Technology was creeping into places where it had never been before. Phones suddenly felt less private. Cars felt less safe for intimate talk. Social clubs that had once been secure now had to be surveyed for listening devices. Sammy adapted. He began to insist on walks when anything serious needed to be discussed. No radios, no televisions humming in the background, just a steady stroll down a side street, voices low, eyes scanning out of habit. He did not know it yet, but this attention to security would one day clash with the showier style of a man who was about to step into the biggest spotlight the family had ever seen. For now, though, in the years when he was solidifying his hold on Brooklyn, the balance still held. Brooklyn nights belonged to people like him. He could stand on a corner and point, without moving his hand, to toward businesses that paid into his world: construction companies, trucking lines, suppliers, restaurants, bars, all of them woven into a web he had helped tighten. From the outside, it might have looked like power. From the inside, it often felt like constant maintenance. Every day, there was some fire to prevent, some misunderstanding to clear, some ambitious kid to calm down before he sprinted off a cliff. Sammy took it on willingly. This was the life he had chosen, the life that had in many ways chosen him. The kid labeled impossible to correct was now the man everyone called when something or someone needed correction. He did not yet realize that the structure he was helping to stabilize was already shifting at the top, that the storm forming above the family would soon demand new loyalties and new risks. He only knew that his world was running, the money was flowing, and respect was steady. On a quiet night, he locked up the club, turned the key with a small twist, and listened for that final click. Behind him, the street stretched out in both directions, traffic lights blinking their red and green patterns, a stray cat darting between parked cars. The city felt almost peaceful for a moment. He slipped the key into his pocket and walked away, the leader of a crew that believed in him, heading toward a future that would test that belief to its limits. Chapter 4: Storm over the family. The Gambino family in those days was like a great ship cutting through dark water. From the outside, it looked solid, unstoppable. Inside, hairline cracks were spreading along the hull. At the top sat Paul Castellano, the boss who preferred suits and suburbs to smoky social clubs. To many in the rank and file he felt distant, like a figure seen only in newspaper photos and whispered stories. Sammy had glimpsed him in meetings and gatherings. Castellano carried himself with a quiet, heavy authority. He spoke softly, but everyone leaned in when he did. His interests leaned heavily toward white-collar angles, construction empires, unions, sophisticated money moves. For a while, that suited the family just fine. Money poured in from unions, ports, trucking, and the growing construction boom. Contacts in certain industries believed they were dealing with respectable businessmen. They were, in a way, just businessmen who could apply unusual pressure when necessary. But on the street level, murmurs grew. Regular soldiers and captains complained that the boss was too concerned with his own comfort, too removed from the old neighborhoods. They said he did not visit the social clubs enough, did not break bread with the lower ranks the way the old bosses had. Some felt that the boss looked down on the more traditional street rackets, that he preferred polished deals in quiet offices to the rougher side of the life. Into that space stepped John Gotti, a captain from Queens with a style that could not be ignored. Where Castellano was reserved, Gotti was flashy. Expensive suits, sharp haircuts, and a laugh that filled rooms. He listened to the grievances of the rank and file, he showed up at wakes and weddings. He stood on corners and let the guys feel that the higher-ups still knew their names. Sammy watched this contrast with a careful eye. On the hand, he respected the boss. Castellino had built something big and complex. On the other hand, he saw how Gotti resonated with the everyday guys who risked their freedom on the street. In coffee shops in Brooklyn and Queens, conversations took on a new temperature. Men stirred sugar into espresso a little more vigorously. They vented about rules that felt sided, about money they believed was being kept too close to the top. Sammy rarely joined in open complaining. He knew better than to let his tongue outrun his brain. But he listened. He gathered information. He could feel the pressure building like steam in old pipes. Some of that pressure focused on certain business decisions. Castellano wanted more control over lucrative rackets. He demanded stricter kicks from captains. Stories circulated that he had special expectations for his personal circle, that he gave certain men preference over others. At the same time, law enforcement was changing the game. Federal agents had begun using new legal tools, long-term investigations, and extended sentences. They were learning the families like maps, identifying leaders and key earners. Wiretaps appeared when nobody had expected them. The bosses were no longer just hearing about agents knocking down doors. They were hearing their own voices play back in courtrooms. Sammy knew that the heat was rising. He made adjustments in his own operations, became even more careful about where and how he spake. But he also understood a hard truth. No matter how careful he was, if the leadership at the top drew too much attention, the whole structure would shake. As tensions with Castellano rose, some captains spoke more openly about their frustrations. Gotti was at the centre of many of those conversations. His crew had its own legal problems, and there was talk of how the boss might handle those. Rumours floated that Castellano was unhappy with the Queen's crew, that he might demote or punish certain people, that he might make an example to remind everyone who held the real power. For a man like John Gotti, that possibility was not just a career problem, it was an existential threat. Sammy found himself pulled into private talks that felt heavier than most. In back rooms and parked cars, men discussed scenarios they would once have considered unthinkable. The idea of changing bosses was not mentioned outright at first. It was wrapped in questions. What happens if the top forgets the bottom? What happens if we let someone at the top put us all in the line of fire? Gradually, the question hardened into plans. Sammy did not enter this stage of the story as a loud instigator. He came in as a man whose judgment and toughness were respected. Gotti knew that Brooklyn saw Sammy as a serious figure. Any serious move would need allies from more than one borough. Plans were drawn up in whispers and careful nods. They studied the boss's habits the way you might study a train schedule, where he ate, which routes he took, when he felt most secure. The goal was not just to unalive a man, it was to change the entire direction of one of the most powerful families in the country. Sammy weighed the risks. On Ven's side, loyalty to the existing boss and the long tradition that said you did not go against the throne without cause. On the other side, the belief that the current leadership might drag the whole organization into disaster. In his mind, it was not just about one man versus another. It was about which version of the future had a better chance of keeping the structure intact, keeping his own people alive and free. The decision came down in his heart like a slow-falling hammer. He would support Gotti. The day of the move against Castellano arrived like any other on the surface. Office workers rushed through Midtown, cabs honked, shoppers hurried along chilly sidewalks. Nobody outside a small circle understood that history was about to be rewritten near a steakhouse entrance under streetlights that had seen only ordinary drama until then. Sammy was not the woe pulling the trigger. His role was strategic, part of the planning and the backup. He was close enough to feel the shockwave, but not so close that his face would dominate the newspapers. When the boss was unalived on that Manhattan sidewalk, the news raced through the city faster than any car. Phones rang in social clubs and homes. Men who had just ordered dinner found their appetite gone. Others, who had been simmering in resentment, felt a cold jolt of satisfaction mixed with dread. Sammy heard the news in a setting that would forever be burned into his memory. For a moment, time stretched. The clatter of dishes, the murmur of television, the hum of city life all faded behind the words. The boss is gone. He closed his eyes briefly, acknowledging the enormity of what had been done. There was no going back now. In the hours and days that followed, the family moved quickly to stabilize itself. Confusion and fear were the enemies now. The worst thing that could happen would be scattered panic, captains making their own wild moves, soldiers jumping ship. Gotti stepped forward into the vacuum with almost theatrical certainty. He appeared in sleek suits, smiled for cameras, and moved through court appearances like a celebrity. The tabloids loved him. The public, used to bosses hiding in the shadows, was fascinated by this man who laughed and strutted like a star. Inside the family, reactions were mixed. Some adored him. To them, he was everything a street boss should be: confident, generous with his time, loyal to his people. Others were uneasy. The visibility made them nervous. The cameras meant more eyes on all of them. Sammy, now drawn closer than ever to the center of power, watched carefully. He saw the way Gotti loved the spotlight. He saw how the new boss worked a room, how he made everyone feel like his friend, at least for a moment. He also saw how the constant attention invited more focus from federal agents. The storm that had unseated Castellano had not cleared the sky. It had simply shifted the clouds. Sammy's own position rose quickly in the new order. Gotti trusted him, saw the value in a man who combined street respect with business sense. Sammy's record in construction, unions, and Brooklyn leadership made him an obvious pick for greater responsibility. He found himself called upon for counsel on matters that extended far beyond his old corners. Who could be trusted in certain boroughs? Which businesses were worth expanding into? How to handle the increased pressure from federal investigations? The nights grew longer. He would sit with Gotti and others in rooms that felt both important and strangely fragile. Jokes would bounce off the walls, stories about old times were told and retold. Then the talk would turn serious, the laughter replaced by quiet planning. Outside, the city never slept. Agents tailed cars, cameras clicked outside courthouses. Reporters camped near certain well-known hangouts, hoping we're more shot of the so-called dapper boss. Sammy felt the strain of balancing two opposing forces. On one side, the need to project strength and unity. On the other, the need to stay low, quiet, invisible. Gotti leaned toward the first. Sammy, by instinct, leaned toward the second. For a while, that tension stayed manageable. The storm over the family was still forming. Inside, beneath the glow of dim lights and swirling smoke, men enjoyed the feeling of having pulled off the impossible, of having changed the boss at the top of a major family. There was a sense of pride and destiny in the air. Sammy was not immune to that feeling. He knew he had been part of something historic, something that would be talked about in hushed voices for decades. He also knew that every action carries a price tag that might not be visible at the start. As he stepped out of a late-night meeting one evening, the chill Manhattan air hit his face. He looked up at towering buildings, their windows lit like 1,000 tiny eyes. Somewhere among them, agents and prosecutors were already plotting their own long game. He buttoned his coat and walked toward a waiting car. The kid who had once stared through half-open club doors in Bensonhurst had become a central figure in a drama that now played out on the front page and in federal offices. The storm had arrived. The question, unspoken but heavy in his chest, was how long he could stand in the center of it without being swept away. Chapter 5: Underboss in the Spotlight. The day Sammy was named Underboss did not come with fireworks. It came with a nod, a few serious words, and a quiet understand that everything in his life had just become heavier. He had climbed from corner kid to soldier, from soldier to captain, from captain to trusted advisor. Each step up the ladder meant more responsibility and less room for mistakes. Underboss was a different category altogether. It meant that when the boss spoke to the family, Sammy's voice echoed behind his words. John Gotti loved the spotlight. The newspapers called him the Dapper Don and the Teflon Man. He strutted past cameras as if they were old friends. He smiled outside courthouses and treated reporters like extras in a movie he was directing. Sammy was the man at his side, a little quieter, a little harder to read. The Wahoo's name did not play as well in headlines but carried equal weight in backrooms. On certain nights, the Ravenite social club in Little Italy felt like the center of the universe. Cars lined the block. Men in tailored coats came and went. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke, expensive cologne, and the hum of constant conversation. Gotti held court at the main table, laughing loud, tapping ash into an overflowing tray, waving people closer. Sammy often sat near him, taking in the flow of faces. Captains came to report earnings, to seek permission, to complain about rivals. Old-timers came to pay respect. Younger soldiers came in just to feel the warmth of being close to power. On the surface, it looked like one long party. Jokes, rounds of drinks, loud stories about old neighborhood scuffles. But underneath, decisions were being made that affected hundreds of lives. Territories were redrawn, businesses were assigned, disputes were settled with a few words from the boss or a single look from the underboss. Sammy's gift in that environment was simple and rare. He could separate performance from substance. He understood that Gotti's showmanship served a purpose. The loyal soldiers loved seeing their boss treated like a celebrity instead of a terrified shadow. It gave them pride. It made them feel invincible. At the same time, Sammy had spent his life understanding how attention works, and he knew that too much of it came with a price. Law enforcement fed on attention. The more cameras pointed at the boss, the more agents leaned in. Inside his own mind, he kept a quiet ledger of risks. He tried to steer certain conversations away from the busiest rooms. He advised private walks when a subject felt too sensitive. He warned about patterns, about how often they used the same spots, the same routes. Sometimes his caution was heard, sometimes it was ignored. Away from the clubs and restaurants, his life had another side. He still came home to family dinners, to kids doing homework at the kitchen table, to a wife who had watched his rise with a mix of pride and worry. The money was better now, the house was bigger, the suits in his closet were finer, but the pressures that walked in with him every night were invisible and sharp. He tried to keep his temper in check at home. The underboss could not stomp around like a frustrated soldier. He had to show control both in the street and in his living room. There were moments, though, when the two worlds collided in small emotional earthquakes. A phone would ring during a birthday celebration. A side matter would suddenly turn urgent. A federal indictment might land on a man he knew, pulling Sammy's thoughts away even as he smiled at a family joke. His children saw more than he wished they did. They recognized that their father was no ordinary businessman. They heard whispers at school, saw glances from neighbors. They caught glimpses of late-night visitors whose faces appeared on television news. Sometimes his wife would look across the table at him with eyes that asked a question she already knew the answer to. Is this life worth what it costs us? He rarely gave that question voice. When he did, he framed it as duty, as a path he had chosen long ago and could not abandon without shattering too many structures. Meanwhile, outside his home, unseen listeners were closing in. Federal agents had learned from past mistakes. They no longer focused only on the boss. They studied everyone around him. They planted microphones in cars and clubs. They tapped phones and cultivated informants. The Ravenite Club, the place that felt like the family's living room, was eventually wired. Conversations that should have been loose and harmless sometimes strayed into dangerous territory. Jokes carried details that were not as vague as the speakers believed. Boasts that sounded impressive in the moment sounded very different when replayed in a courtroom. Sammy had an instinct for when the air in a room changed. He could tell when men were speaking too freely, when they forgot that walls had ears. He tried to keep his own words measured. He still believed in the old rule that silence was the best protection, that the less you said, the less anyone could use against you. But he was also human. There were moments when anger slipped out, when frustration with rivals or traitors pulled sharp phrases from his tongue. There were nights when the drinks went down too easy and the old stories carried a little too much detail. All the while, federal agents listened patiently. They built files, drew charts, connected names. In cold offices, they listened to heated arguments and smug jokes, rewinding and replaying passages where someone said a little too much. Within the family, subtle cracks began to show. Some captains wondered if the new, flashy era was worth the heat it drew. Others were intoxicated by the fame, happy to ride the wave as long as it lasted. Loyalties shifted like sand, mostly in murmurs, rarely in open defiance. Sammy felt the strain in his relationship with Gotti. They were tied together by shared history and mutual success. They had stood on the same side when the old boss fell. They had navigated early legal storms together, walking out of court after acquittals that felt like miracles. Yet certain patterns nagged at him. He saw decisions that seemed more theatrical than strategic. He heard about comments made behind his back, small criticisms that painted him as too cautious or too eager to question the boss. The underboss is supposed to be the one man the boss trusts more than any other. When that trust begins to fray, the whole structure shakes. Sammy found himself awake at strange hours, sitting in dim rooms with only the glow of a late-night television for company. The news would show another shot of Gotti laughing outside a restaurant. The voiceover would talk about law enforcement closing in. He would lower the volume and think about all the moving parts he had to hold together. Brooklyn still needed attention. Crews still needed guidance. Construction jobs had to be managed. Unions needed quiet handling. On top of that, there were indictments, trials, and the constant worry that someone under pressure might talk. He had always been comfortable in storms, but this what felt different. It did not come from rival families or street war. It came from the government, patient and methodical, armed with tape recorders instead of knives. One evening, after a long meeting that left his head heavy, he stepped outside into the Manhattan night. The streetlights painted everything in a pale gold. Cars crawled past. Tourists laughed as they headed to shows and restaurants, unaware of the dramas unfolding behind nearby doors. He stood there for a moment, coat collar turned up against the wind, and thought about how far he had come. The boy from Bensonhurst, the incorrigible student, the corner kid, the soldier, the captain, now second in command of one of the most powerful criminal families in the country. It should have felt like the peak of a mountain. Instead, it felt like the edge of a cliff. He knew, with the same instinct that had kept him alive through countless situations, that something was going to give. He just did not know when, or what would be left standing when it did. For the moment, he did what he had always done. He straightened his shoulders, walked back to the waiting car, and prepared to face whatever the next day brought. More conversation, one crisis, one decision at a time. Chapter 6. Breaking the Code. In the life Sammy had chosen, there was a rule at the center of everything. You did not talk to the government, you did not cooperate, you did not betray the people you had stood beside. It was more than a rule, it was a belief system, a code that separated their world from the one outside. For most of his life, Sammy accepted that code as absolute. He carried secrets like they were carved into stone. He accepted that prison, even death, might be part of the price. That was the bargain. But bargains are easy when they are theoretical. They are harder when the numbers and names on the other side of the table become real. The federal case that gathered around Gotti and his circle was not a quick storm, it was a slow-rising flood. Agents and prosecutors had spent years listening, watching, learning. They had tapes from the Ravenite Club, they had informants, they had financial records, they had testimonies from lesser players who had decided long before Sammy ever would that survival meant cooperation. Indictments landed like heavy books on a desk. Sammy was charged alongside Gotti and others. The paperwork listed counts that added up to more years than any human being could serve. It was a cold math problem. Even with some convictions beaten, the remaining ones could mean spending the rest of his natural life behind bars. At first, he braced himself. This is it, he thought. This is what you always knew might come. You keep your mouth shut, you fight the case, you deal with the outcome. He walked into courtrooms with his chin up, dressed in suits that spoke of dignity, surrounded by lawyers ready to argue about evidence and procedure. The press focused on Gotti, the star of the show, but Sammy's presence did not go unnoticed. He was described in articles with words like feared, ruthless, loyal. They did not see the hours he spent in cells and conference rooms, listening to tapes, reading transcripts, feeling the ground shift. On those tapes he heard his own voice and the voices of men he had broken bread with, men he had trusted. He also heard something worse. He heard Gotti, the boss he had supported through a rebellion, the man whose rise he had helped engineer, blaming him for many of the serious acts the government was interested in. On the tapes, Gotti painted Sammy as the main engine behind the most severe crimes, describing him as a loose cannon, a man who needed to be controlled. He spoke of him not as a vital partner, but as a convenient shield to place between himself and the prosecution. Listening to those recordings was like feeling the floor tilt under his feet. In Nen world, he had always seen himself as the loyal underboss, the man who handled the toughest jobs and carried the heaviest weight, so the boss could stand tall. In another world, the world captured on tape and now in the hands of the government, he was suddenly cast as the main villain, the man the boss might gladly sacrifice to save his own skin. That realization burned deeply. He sat with his lawyers, hands folded, while they laid out the reality. The government had tapes that could convict him on multiple serious charges. The potential sentence was vast. The chances of walking out a free man after trial were slim. Then came the offer, spoken in careful, professional voices. If he cooperated, if he told the full story of his life in the family, if he testified truthfully against Gotti and others, the government would consider a reduced sentence. He might see daylight again as a free man. The words hung in the air. Cooperate, testify, turn. He had spent his entire adult life surrounded by men who would rather die than take that path. He had watched people stand tall at sentencing, accepting decades without flinching. He had seen families move on with quiet pride, saying at least he did not talk. Now he had to weigh that lifelong belief against a new fact. The man at the top, the man he had risked everything for, had already turned on him in his own way, at least in conversation. Still, walking away from the code felt like tearing his own skin. Alone in his cell at night, he lay on a narrow bed and replayed his life, chapter by chapter. He saw the boy in Bensonhurst, watching older men with a mixture of fear and admiration. He saw the young soldier earning his bones, proving himself in the only system that had ever truly accepted him. He saw the captain handling business, the underboss balancing power and family. He saw the desert sunsets in Arizona years later, the witness protection life that would come, the second fall, though that was still in his future. All of it rested on a foundation of loyalty. Loyalty to the life, loyalty to the family, loyalty to the men beside him. Now he had to ask a question he had never dared. What happens when loyalty is not returned? The answer did not come in a burst. It came slowly, through long talks with his lawyers, through quiet moments of reflection, through the worn-out feeling of a man who had given everything to a code that did not protect him the way he had protected it. He thought of his own family. He pictured his children, grown but still in need of their father. He thought of grandkids he might never hold if he stayed silent. He thought of his wife, her years spent worrying about knocks on the door, about phone calls in the night. He pictured them visiting him in some far-off prison year after year, until his hair turned white and his body gave out. Then he pictured something else, a life under protection, with a new identity, a chance, however fragile, to start over. The shame would be real. The judgment from his old world would be harsh, but his family might have a husband, a father, a grandfather on the outside. The choice was not between honor and betrayal in a simple way. It was between two different forms of betrayal. Stay silent, and he betrayed his family's hope for a future with him. Cooperate, and he betrayed a code he had sworn to uphold. For a long time he resisted. He told his lawyers no, he paced his cell, tightened his jaw, and prepared himself for trial. He tried to convince himself that the higher road was to stand firm and let the government prove what it could. But the tapes played again and again in his head. Gotti's voice, dismissive, shifting blame, drawing a line that placed Sammy squarely on the side of maximum punishment. The boss was not quietly preparing to share his fate. He was loudly preparing to separate himself. Finally, one day, something in Sammy's mind clicked into place. If the boss could throw him under the bus in private, why should he sacrifice his entire life to protect that man in public? If the code meant that only one side had to honor it, was it a code or a leash? He agreed to talk. The moment he made that decision, he stepped into a new reality. He met with federal agents and prosecutors in guarded rooms. They laid out questions, thick as phone books. He told his story, detail by detail, year by year. He opened the vault he had kept shut for decades. He did not sugarcoat his own actions. He could not. The government already knew enough to catch him in lies. He had done serious things in service of the family, and he admitted them, one by one. In those interviews, the world shifted. The man who had once been the silent enforcer became the narrator, explaining how business was done, how decisions were made, how money moved from street corners to bosses' pockets. He decoded the language of the family for people who had studied it from the outside for years. There was a strange calm in it. For the first time, he was telling the story from his own perspective, not the version smoothed over for the street, not the myth, just the facts as he remembered them. There was pain in that honesty, and a twisted kind of relief. Eventually came the day he had dreaded and prepared for. He would testify in open court against John Gotti, the man who had once been his friend, his boss, his ally in rebellion. The courtroom was cold and formal. Wooden benches, the soft shuffle of papers. the quiet murmur of spectator and reporters. Gotti sat at the defense table in a sharp suit, surrounded by lawyers, still carrying himself with that familiar mix of charm and defiance. Sammy entered in government custody, a different kind of spotlight on him now. Cameras outside the building had shouted his name too. He was a symbol of something new in that world, a high-ranking underboss who had broken the code. He took the stand, raised his hand and swore to tell the truth. The questions began. Prosecutors guided him through his life. They asked about meetings, crimes, hierarchies. They asked about conversations with Gotti, about decisions they had made together, about events the jury needed to understand. Sammy answered in a steady voice. He kept his words simple. He did not dramatize. He did not try to cast himself as a hero or a victim. He spoke as a man who understood that he had been dangerous and loyal and flawed, all at once. The defense cross-examined him, sharp and aggressive. They called him a liar, a traitor, a man who would say anything to save his own skin. They tried to pick holes in his story, to catch him in contradictions, to make the jury see him as unreliable. He stood there, absorbing each attack, and responded calmly. In his mind, he was beyond saving his old reputation. He knew what the streets would say about him from that day forward. There was no going back to the life anyway. He had burned that bridge the moment he agreed to cooperate. The only thing left was to tell the truth as cleanly as he could and let everyone else decide what to do with it. Outside the courtroom, opinions raged. Some saw him as a necessary breaker of silence, a man whose testimony finally allowed the government to hold powerful figures accountable. Others saw him as the worst kind of traitor. Inside himself, he felt something more complicated. He did not see himself as brave. He did not see himself as noble. He saw himself as a man cornered by fate, by his own decisions, by a boss who had chosen self-preservation over loyalty, by a government that now held all the cards. Breaking the code did not bring him joy. It simply opened a door to a different kind of prison, one with new names, new locations, and a lifetime of memories that could never be erased. When the trial ended and verdicts were read, the world of the Gambino family changed forever. Bosses went away for life. The mythology of invincible dons cracked in front of cameras and reporters. Sammy watched from a distance, both a cause and a witness. The underboss who had helped take down the old boss, who had helped raise up the new one, had now helped the government unseat that new boss as well. His path had carried him from the back of a Brooklyn classroom for troubled kids to the center of one of the most famous criminal cases in modern history. As he stepped into federal protection, heading toward a new identity and a new chapter far from New York, he carried a quiet understand. Codes are only as strong as the people who honor them. Once trust breaks, the code breaks with it. He had broken it, yes, but he also knew it had already been cracked long before he said a single word. Chapter 7: A Ghost in Arizona. When the last gavel dropped and the courtrooms of New York were finally behind him, Sammy stepped into a strange kind of quiet. For the first time since he was a restless kid in Bensonhurst, he did not know every alley or every corner of the world around him. The federal government had taken him out of the web he had helped spin and placed him in a holding pattern. Note the old kind of holding cell with iron bars and peeling paint, but a different sort of confinement built from paperwork and promises. There were briefings in neutral rooms with walls that looked like they had never heard a raised voice. Agents sat across from him with folders and coffee, talking about safety and relocation, and something they called a new chapter. Witness protection sounded simple on paper. New name, new home, new story. In practice, it felt like walking away from his own reflection. They showed him maps with regions circled, the middle of the country, the far west, towns and cities where nobody knew his face or his history, where Sammy the Bull was just a name in somebody else's newspaper. He listened and nodded while his thoughts drifted back to Brooklyn sidewalks and the hum of elevated trains. In the end, they settled on the desert, Arizona, a place he had barely thought about before, a word that made him picture cowboy movies and wide roads and heat that came at you from every direction. The agent spoke of it like a solution. Far from New York, growing population, easier to blend in. He agreed, not because he felt excited, but because none of the other options stirred anything inside him either. When your past is heavy, the compass spins in circles. The move happened without fanfare. There was no line of waiting reporters this time, no cheering crowds outside a courthouse. Just flights under watchful eyes, temporary beds in secure locations, and a stream of small instructions about what he could and could not reveal to anyone he might meet. When he finally stepped out of an airport in the Phoenix area, the first thing that struck him was the heat. New York heat in summer was thick and sticky, something you waded through. Arizona heat was different. It wrapped him in a dry grip, like he had stepped under a giant hairdryer. The sun felt closer here, personal in a way he had never experienced. He rode through wide avenues bordered by palm trees and low buildings painted in shades of sand and terracotted. Strip malls lined the roads, each wore a repeating pattern of storefronts and neon signs. Mountains loomed in the distance, purple and orange in the late afternoon light. Brooklyn had always felt like it was leaning over him. Fire escapes, power lines, brick facades pressing in from every side. This place was the opposite. Open, sprawling, exposed. Witness protection came with a script. Here is your new name. Here is your cover story. Here is the job we can explain if someone asks too many questions. You are just another transplant looking for sun and cheaper rent, that is all. He tried the name out loud once in a mirror and felt nothing. It sat on his tongue like a borrowed jacket that did not quite fit. Still, he understood the importance of the game. Stay inside the lines, they said, and the past will have a harder time finding you. His first home in Arizona was ordinary, in a way that made it almost unreal. A single-story house on a quiet street, a small yard with a patch of grass that fought for survival in the dry soil, a driveway wide enough for 2 cars, neighbors who waved on their way to work, who put up holiday lights in winter and inflatable decorations in front of their garages. He watched it all with a cautious curiosity. At night, instead of the low roar of traffic and the distant rumble of trains, there were crickets and the occasional bark of a dog. The sky stretched overhead in a wide, star-dotted arc, free of the heavy haze he had grown up under. On paper, it was peaceful. Inside, he carried a constant hum of restlessness. For decades, his days had been packed with decisions and dangers, meetings at odd hours, problems to solve, money to move, fires to put out. Someone always needed him. His phone had been a lifeline and a leash. Now he woke up to stillness. The protection officers encouraged him to think about work, about a business, about building something legitimate. A steady job would make his new identity feel solid, they said. It would also keep him from pacing a groove into the floor. He knew construction. He knew how to manage men and materials, how to read blueprints and job sites even without formal training. In the desert, construction had its own language, and one word came up constantly: pools. In Arizona, pools were almost as common as stoops in Brooklyn. Every other backyard seemed to hide a rectangle or curve of blue water behind a fence. People paid good money for them, and more money to fix the problems that came with heat and use. He started small. At first, he did consulting and odd jobs, helping on renovations, watching how local companies worked. The desert ground was hard and stubborn. Digging meant fighting with rock and packed earth. He studied the materials, the schedules, the inspectors. Then he opened his own pool installation and renovation business. There was something almost poetic in it. A man who had once moved through concrete jungles now making water appear in desert backyards. New customers met him as a friendly, slightly weathered contractor. He shook hands, walked their yards, listened to their dreams of backyard parties and afternoon swims. He suggested designs, discussed costs, nodded along as they fretted about tile colors and coping stones. No one asked about organized crime. No one mentioned Gotti or the Gambino family. To them, he was simply the pool guy with a New York accent and a direct way of talking. He ran the company the only way he knew how. He expected his crews to show up on time. He insisted on quality. He kept track of every invoice, every supply run, every schedule. He pushed to complete jobs when he said they would be completed. The reputation he had once built in Brooklyn, as a man who got things done quietly, began, in a different form, to grow under the Arizona sun. But the ghosts of his past did not vanish. They just changed outfits. Every time a stranger looked twice at him in a supermarket, a voice in his head whispered maybe they know. When he sat at a diner counter sipping coffee, he automatically chose the seat with the best view of the door. In parking lots, he still glanced in his rearview mirror more often than a normal businessman might. The old instincts were not habits, they were survival tools. He tried to be a good father and grandfather in this strange new soil. Family members visited and eventually settled nearby. There were birthday parties with balloons tied to patio fences, barbecues where kids ran around with plastic cups of soda, crowded kitchen tables full of food and overlapping stories. Sometimes, during those evenings, he would feel a sharp, unexpected happiness. He had lived long enough to have grandkids laughing in his ear, long enough to stand at a grill and complain about the price of meat like any other older man in the suburbs. Then, without warning, a memory would cut in. A face from the old neighborhood, a street in Brooklyn, a door that had closed on someone who never came back. He would blink, smile a little too tightly, and change the subject. The book project came into his life like another ghost. Writers had already filled shelves with stories about Gotti and the Gambinos. Reporters had written about the trials, about his cooperation, about the break with the code. The idea of telling his own story in full, on his own terms, started as a suggestion in a meeting and slowly became a serious plan. He met with a writer who was calm, persistent, and curious about everything. They sat for long hours in quiet rooms while he talked about Bensonhurst nights, about fights and friendships, about the rise through the family. He spoke about crimes in careful language, not to hide them, but to keep the focus on motives and choices rather than lurid detail. The writer asked about loyalty, about betrayal, about how he had justified his decisions at each stage. Sometimes Sammy answered easily. Other times he stared at the table for long stretches, chasing memories that did not want to be caught. Telling the story stirred up old storms. He dreamed of courtrooms and social clubs, of the Ravenite basement, of late-night meetings in parked cars. Arizona mornings found him a little more tired, his coffee a little stronger. When the book Underboss finally came out, it landed like a stone dropped into several ponds at once. In the old neighborhoods back east, some people cursed his name between puffs of cigarette smoke. Others read every page like a secret map they had been waiting years to see. Law enforcement people underlined passages. Readers who had never set foot in New York bought copies to satisfy a fascination with the hidden machinery of organized crime. In Arizona, the effect was more local and immediate. Neighbors who had once waved at him with casual friendliness now had context for the vague rumors they had heard. They saw his face on television reports pairing the former underboss with footage of New York streets and courthouse steps. Some retreated politely, nodding without making eye contact. Others leaned in with a kind of nervous curiosity, asking questions that danced around the heart of the matter. "So you were from New York, right? Busy life back there." He would give measured answers and then steer the topic back to pools or the weather. The book brought money and exposure, both a blessing and a complication. Money helped his family. Exposure poked at the thin shell of anonymity that witness protection had built around him. He had never really fit the mold of someone who could disappear easily. His story was too large, his role in it too central. Through all of this, he kept up the routine: wake early, check job schedules, visit sites, walk around trenches where pools would soon sit shimmering in the heat, inspect grout lines, negotiate with suppliers, make calls, return home tired but occupied. Yet the restless part of him never fully quieted. At family gatherings, younger people sometimes asked him for advice, not just about work or relationships, but about life. How do you handle pressure? How do you stay calm when everything is going wrong? He would talk about discipline, about focus, about keeping your word. Inside, though, he knew that the biggest struggle he had never mastered was staying away from risk once he had tasted it. Arizona had given him sun, space, and a second chance. What he chose to do with that chance would define the next turn in his story. On some nights, the desert sky seemed almost too big. He would step outside, the air finally cool, and look up at stars so clear they felt close enough to touch. The silence pressed in on him. No sirens, no cab horns, no subway rumble. Just the hum of distant highway and the occasional yip of a coyote far away. In that silence he could hear himself think in a way he never had in New York. Sometimes that was a blessing. Sometimes it was a curse. He had escaped the streets where his reputation had been forged. He had slipped through the fingers of a life sentence in a federal prison. He was breathing air that men he had once known would never breathe again. For a while that knowledge felt like enough. But the past has its own gravity. And in a world where new money was flowing through new kinds of crime, old skills and old appetites were about to be tested under a different kind of neon. The ghost in Arizona was not as invisible as he believed, and the desert, for all its space, could not keep the old shadows away forever. Chapter 8: The Arizona Case. In stories, second chances often arrive wrapped in clarity. A man sees his mistakes, turns his back on them, and walks into the light, lesson learned. Real life is not that clean. For a time, Sammy's life in Arizona moved along a steady track. The pool business grew, the family settled. The book had come and gone in waves of conversation. He was an older man with a new routine, a veteran of storms living in borrowed calm. Then the late 90s rolled over the country like a tide of neon color and thumping bass. Nightclubs pulsed in cities from coast to coast. Warehouse parties drew crowds of young people chasing music and oblivion. They wore glow sticks and wide smiles, and in their hands and mouths appeared small tablets that promised energy and euphoria. Ecstasy. The word itself sounded softer than the substances he had known back in New York. But the money in it was real, and the networks behind it were learning, growing, stretching across borders. In Arizona, the club scene was smaller than in New York or Miami, but it was hungry. College students, young professionals, and nomads drifting through the desert nightlife all wanted in on the new experience. Where there is demand, there is supply. Where supply grows, structure follows. Some younger operators in the area were not built for structure. They were reckless, waving cash around, bragging in clubs, handling risk like it was part of the party. They had no sense of how law enforcement thinks, how investigations stack small events into major cases. To them, Sammy was a legend that had somehow stepped out of old news footage into their strip mall world. They knew enough about his past to be impressed. Some had read the book, others had only heard fragments of stories passed between friends. Either way, they saw him as an encyclopedia of how to move illegal product without getting crushed. At first he tried to stand aside. He would hear them talk about connections in Europe, about shipments that slipped through airports, about pills changing hands in clubs lit by spinning lights. They complained about disorganization, about people skimming, about partners who panicked at the first sign of authority. He gave advice as if he were commenting on a movie. Stay quiet, do not flash money, keep business and parties separate, never talk serious details in loud places. But giving advice without getting involved is like standing ankle deep at the edge of the ocean. Sooner or later, a larger wave will drag you in. They wanted more than words. They wanted his system. He had spent a lifetime building systems of distribution and control. In New York, it had been construction and unions and gambling and more. Here, he saw another set of moving parts that could, in theory, be arranged more safely. The trouble is, once you start rearranging parts, you become part of the machine. One connection led to another. One favor turned into regular involvement. Slowly, his guidance became direction. Direction became management. The Arizona ecstasy ring took shape with him somewhere near its center, not as a street-level runner, but as a seasoned mind helping organize routes, players, and profits. For a brief time it seemed to work. Product moved, money came in. The younger guys admired him not just as a story, but as an active mentor. He was back in an environment he understood deeply, where every conversation had layers, where every decision carried risk and reward. It felt, in a twisted way, like being young again. Yet this was not New York. The geography was different. The culture was different. Law enforcement was different too, but no less determined. They had learned from decades of chasing organized crime. They had adapted just as criminals had. Instead of only focusing on traditional mob families, they now watched drug networks, gangs, and hybrids that did not fit old categories. They followed money through banks and wire transfers. They listened quietly for chatter about major suppliers. In back offices in Arizona and beyond, agents started drawing lines on charts with Sammy's name somewhere on the page once again. The investigation into the ecstasy ring did not explode overnight. It grew slowly, fed by informants, surveillance, controlled buys. Undercover officers sat in cars outside meeting spots, logged license plates, recorded comings and goings. Some people in the ring began to feel the pressure. A car that appeared too often, a stranger asking careful question, an unexpected traffic stop that seemed just a little too convenient. Nervous jokes started to surface at gatherings. You think they are on us. You think they know. Sammy recognized the signs. He had lived through investigations before. He felt the old familiar tightening in his chest, that sense that the walls, invisible and silent, were drawing in. Part of him wanted to pull back, to cut ties, to retreat fully into business and family life. But organizations are not like light switches. You cannot simply flick them off and walk away without consequences. There were commitments, promises, money still flowing through the pipeline. And there was pride. Even after everything he had seen, he still believed in his own ability to manage risk, to outthink the people watching him. It was a belief forged in years of surviving situations that should have gone sideways. He misjudged how much the world had changed. When the hammer finally dropped, it did not tap politely. It slammed down. Raids were coordinated across locations. Doors gave way under heavy boots. People woke up to shouts and flashlights and the cold click of metal on wrists. Agents in jackets marked with 3 bold letters moved through hallways and yards like a tide. Sammy was arrested again, older now, hair grayer, body slower, but posture still straight. The familiar routines returned: chain of custody, processing, holding cells, arraignments. He felt an almost surreal sense of repetition. Different state, different decade, different charges, same heavy air in courthouse hallways. The indictment laid it out. Conspiracy, distribution, organized involvement in a large-scale ecstasy ring. There were pages of details, numbers of pills, descriptions of routes, mentions of roles. His name appeared alongside those of people much younger than him, some barely older than his grandchildren. One of the hardest blows was seeing how many of those names were tied to his own family. Children, relatives, people who had followed him to Arizona hoping for a quiet life and instead found themselves pulled into a new chapter of crime. Some had joined willingly, drawn by the prospect of money and excitement. Others had been absorbed slowly, almost without noticing the line they were crossing. Sitting at a defense table, he watched them across the room, their faces carrying fear and resentment and love all at once. He had dragged them into a storm that they might never have found on their own. The government's case was strong. They had informants who had been inside the operation, wearing recording devices and passing along information. They had undercover officers who had bought product, who could testify under oath to the scale of the ring. They had surveillance reports and seized drugs, bank records and intercepted messages. In the old days, he had seen prosecutors fumble, watched cases fall apart under the weight of technical errors or weak evidence. Here, he saw no fumble. The case marched forward like a train. Cooperation was not really on the table this time in the same way it had been back in New York. He had already played that card once, in the most high-profile way imaginable. The government had extracted what they needed from him for their war or traditional organized crime. Now, in this new context, he was not a key to a larger door. He was the door. His lawyers argued whatever they could. They challenged details, questioned the credibility of certain witnesses, tried to soften the picture of his involvement. But the broad shape of the case remained. Sammy spent long hours in a cell once more, staring at grey walls, listening to the echo of footsteps in corridors. He was older now, and the weight of time pressed more heavily on his bones. He thought about all the pivot points of his life. That first fight as a kid, the decision to join the life, the choice to support Gotti against Castellano, the moment he agreed to cooperate with the government, the day he first sat with young Arizona players and offered them advice about risk. Each decision had felt, at the time, like the only rational move based on what he knew and who he was. Seen together, they formed a chain that had led him to this cell, in this state, at this age. Sentencing day arrived. He stood before a judge who recited the charges, the evidence, the guidelines. The courtroom was cool, the air conditioner humming like a distant engine. Family members and reporters filled the benches, each with their own reasons for being there. The sentence was long, years stacked upon years, enough that many people his age might never walk out again without help from higher forces or changes in the law. He did not collapse. He did not cry. He took it in with a certain weary acceptance. In his life, time had always been a currency. He had spent it recklessly as a young man, staying up for days, running from one end of the city to the other. He had traded it as a middle-aged man, gambling years in prison against the possibility of beating cases. Now in his later years, the bill had arrived again. Prison this time felt heavier. The body that had once moved through streets like a storm now ached after long walks in a yard. The face that had once filled rooms with hard focus now showed lines carved by decades of stress and regret. Still, some things did not change. Inside, men recognized him. News of who he was came before he did. Some approached with respect, wanting stories. Others came with caution, wary of his past cooperation with law enforcement. A few carried grudges they had picked up from tales heard second or third hand. He managed his interactions carefully. He stayed away from unnecessary drama. He kept his schedule simple. Meals, yard, reading, exercise as much as his body allowed, phone calls when he could. He watched television but rarely let the images pull him too deep into the flow of the outside world. Nights were the hardest. In the quiet of a cell, memories played on an endless loop. He saw his father's face, his mother's hands, the narrow halls of the school for incorrigibles, the bright glare of Manhattan courtrooms, the faces of men who were gone, both enemies and friends. He thought about morality more than he ever had, not in a simple way of good versus bad, but in the messy reality of choices made under pressure, of loyalty offered and broken, of harm done in the name of codes that did not hold when the wind changed. He did not pretend to be innocent. He knew exactly what he had done over the course of his life. Yet he also understood that the story, in full, was not as simple as the labels people put on him. Years passed. Outside, technology evolved. The world moved faster. Phones became small computers. Social media rewired how people shared stories and built reputations. The old street corner and the new online platform served similar purposes for a different generation. Inside, time still moved in its slow, grinding way. Eventually, shifts in the legal landscape, credits for time served and the simple passage of years combined to open a narrow path toward release. When that path finally became real, it felt almost unreal. He walked out of prison older, his step careful, his lungs drinking air that tasted of possibility and fatigue in equal measure. The sun on his face was both familiar and strange, as if he had stepped into a world that had grown while he had shrunk. He had outlived many men who had once stood beside him. He had also outlived several versions of himself. Now he faced a different kind of question. What do you do with the remaining time when your story has already looped through rise and fall more than once? The answer would not come in a single flash of insight. It would unfold slowly, in small rooms where microphones waited, in conversations with a new kind of audience. The underboss turned witness, turned Arizona defendant, was about to become something else again, a storyteller. But before he sat down in front of those microphones, before the lights blinked red and the recordings began, he stood alone in a room for a moment, listening to his own breathing. He had walked through a life that most people only see in movies and books. Now he would spend his final chapters talking about it, trying to turn the weight of his past into words that might keep some other restless kid from following the same map. Chapter 9. The Storyteller. Freedom, when it finally came again, felt less like a trumpet blast and more like the slow creak of an old door. By the time Sammy walked out of prison, he was no longer the man who had strode into social clubs in silk shirts, or even the man who had supervised crews under the Arizona sun. Age had settled into his joints. His hair had thinned and lightened. His eyes still held the same focused glint, but now it floated in a face mapped with lines. The world outside had changed while he was gone. Phones had become thin glass rectangles that could do the work of a newsroom, a radio station, a camera crew, and a gossip circle all at once. People walked down sidewalks staring at screens in their hands, their attention split between the concrete under their feet and digital universes humming in the air. Cars came with touch screens on the dashboard. Cashiers asked about rewards apps. Strangers talked casually about followers, likes, and going viral, as if fame was not something rare but a technical setting anyone could unlock. To a man raised in an era when information travelled through whispers and newspaper ink, it all felt slightly unreal. At first, he kept his world small. There were medical appointments to attend to. Years in prison had taken their toll. Doctors poked and scanned and explained test results in quiet voices. Family members hovered at his shoulder, sometimes fussing, sometimes sitting in the waiting room with folded hands. There were simple pleasures to reclaim. Coffee and a kitchen where he could choose his own mug. The feeling of a real mattress that did not belong to an institution. A shower taken without watching the clock or listening for the sound of a guard's keys. He spent long afternoons with family, listening more than talking. Children had become parents, grandchildren had grown taller. New stories filled the table. School struggles, first jobs, moves to new cities. The problems at that table were mostly ordinary, which was a blessing. Sometimes he would offer advice. Other times he would simply watch, letting the sound wash over him like a language he had almost forgotten. But his past did not intend to stay silent. For decades his name had rolled through books, documentaries, news specials. Journalists and producers knew that he was out. Some had been waiting. Messages began to filter in, through lawyers, through old contacts, through tentative calls. People wanted to hear him talk. Not in a courtroom this time, and not through a ghostwriter. They wanted to film him. They wanted him to sit in a chair under lights and answer questions for an audience that had grown up on true crime channels and long-form interviews. He had mixed feelings. On one side there was fatigue. He had lived his life, paid in years, burned bridges, lost friends, hurt people. Part of him wanted to fade out in some quiet neighborhood and let the stories dry up. On the other side, there was a sense that if people were going to keep talking about him anyway, he might as well tell the story in his own voice. Not to glorify anything, but to lay it out clearly, to show how choices pile up until a life becomes something heavy and strange. The first step back into the public eye was an interview. It took place in a studio that looked like a cross between a warehouse and a living room. Brick walls, soft chairs, big cameras on wheeled stands. Young producers moved around with headsets and tablets, speaking in a shorthand that mixed technical jargon with slang. They wired him up with a small microphone clipped to his shirt. A makeup person dabbed at his forehead. Someone checked the light on his face and nodded with satisfaction. He sat across from a host who had grown up hearing his name on television, a person young enough to be his grandchild yet now guiding the conversation as an equal. They traded small talk before the recording began. The host admitted with a half laugh that they were a little nervous. Sammy thought that was funny. In his life, nerves had usually belonged to the other side of the table. Once the cameras rolled, something settled in him. He knew how to tell a story. He had been doing it in clubs and bars and cars for most of his life. The audience was larger now, but the basic skill was the same. Start at the beginning, give enough detail to paint the picture, keep the rhythm steady. Do not lie, because lies twist and break. He talked about Bensonhurst nights, about the school for troubled kids, about the rise through the ranks. He spoke in simple sentences, letting the weight sit where it wanted to. The host asked about loyalty, about betrayal, about what he regretted. They asked whether he missed that life, whether he had trouble sleeping, whether he believed he deserved any kind of peace. He answered without trying to polish his image. He said that he had done terrible things, that no one forced him, that he had believed in a code that had cracked. He said that cooperation had saved his life, but shredded his stand-in a world he had once valued above everything. He talked about victims in the soft language of a man who knows there are families out there who will never forgive him and who do not owe him forgiveness. The interview found an audience online. Clips circulated. People watched on laptops and phones, leaving comments in endless scrolls beneath his face. Some called him fascinating. Others called him a monster, a traitor, a necessary witness, a cautionary tale. He did not read all the reactions, but snippets reached him. Some viewers were drawn to his calm way of speaking. They expected wildness and got reflection instead. Others were angry that a man who had once lived by crime could now speak into cameras and earn money from his own legend. The attention brought new offers. Producers suggested a podcast built entirely around his stories. They pointed out how many people listened to long audio shows while driving or washing dishes or lying in bed. They said that his voice, steady and gravel-edged, was perfect for that format. A podcast, they explained, was like a radio show that never ended. Episodes could be recorded in batches, released on a schedule, clipped into shorter pieces. He could talk about his past, about his thoughts on modern crime, about life lessons. He could even bring in guests if he wanted. They proposed a simple, powerful title, Our Thing. It was a phrase that had always carried a special meaning in the old world, a way to talk about the life without naming it. Now it would be the banner for a show where he pulled back the curtain. The idea was risky. On one hand, it offered him a chance to earn income in a way that did not require breaking any laws. On the other, it could easily be seen as romanticizing a past that had left bodies and broken families behind. He decided to do it, but on his own terms. If he was going to speak, he would not pretend that the life was glamorous in the long run. He would tell the funny stories where they existed, yes, the petty arguments, the neighborhood characters, the ridiculous misunderstandings. But he would also talk about fear, about betrayal, about the way prison sounds at night when 100 men cannot sleep. The first recording session for the podcast felt almost intimate. The studio was smaller than that used for television interviews. Dark walls, a table, 2 microphones on arms that swung like metal branches, a camera or 2 set to capture video in case they wanted to post clips. A young producer, wearing a hoodie and sneakers, sat behind a screen with audio levels dancing in coloured bars. They walked him through the basics. Speak clearly, try not to move too far from the microphone, pause naturally. If he needed to stop and restart a story, they could edit it later. He nodded and took his seat. In front of him, on the table, sat something that looked like a small black spaceship, the main microphones. When he spoke, his own voice came back to him faintly in his headphones, deeper and more present than he remembered. They counted him in. 3, 2, 1. He started talking. He described the smell of an old Brooklyn bakery at dawn, the way the steam from hot bread mixed with cigarette smoke in winter air. He described the rules of the street corner, the unspoken hierarchy of who leaned where. He described, without lurid detail, the first time he understood that his choices could end a life, and what that realization did to his sleep. He did not shout. He did not play the tough guy. He spoke like a grandfather telling stories in a living room after everyone else had gone to bed. Calm, steady, occasionally amused at his younger self, occasionally pausing to let the weight of a memory settle. The episodes went out into the digital wild. People listened on commutes, in gyms, on walks. Users who had grown up far from New York found themselves picturing Bensonhurst sidewalks and the Ravenite Club. Some fell asleep to his voice, the irony of that not lost on anyone paying attention. Not everyone approved. Victims' families and advocates pointed out that this was still a man who had helped run a machine that caused real harm. They asked why someone like that should have a platform, why he should earn money telling war stories from a life that had left scars. Sammy heard those criticisms. They did not bounce off him. He understood them. He had spent too many nights alone with his conscience to ignore the reality behind their anger. On air, he tried to acknowledge this whenever he could. He would tell stories and then say clearly that there was nothing glamorous about where many of those paths had led. He spoke about losing friends, about watching men he had known facing life sentences, about visiting rooms where mothers cried quietly into tissue while lawyers talked about decades. The younger people around him sometimes struggled with this balance. Producers were aware of what drew clicks and shares, guests, arguments, dramatic reveals. They suggested hotter topics, more controversial angles. He pushed back when he felt the tone drifting towards simple spectacle. He was not interested in playing the cartoon gangster for an endless carnival of content. At home, microphones followed him in a different way. Grandkids teased him about being internet famous. They pulled up clips on phones and showed him comments that were half adoration and half outrage. They joked that he had gone from the streets to the streams. He rolled his eyes, but he could not deny there was something darkly funny about a former underboss worrying about upload schedules and thumbnail images. At night, after recording sessions that stretched for hours, he would sit alone for a while. The studio would cool off once the lights were off and the equipment powered down. The young producers would say goodnight, the door would shut, and the hum of air conditioning would be the only sound. Sometimes he stayed. He would sit at the table, hands folded, staring at the now silent microphone. This small piece of metal and wire had become his new confessional. He had poured more truth into it than he had into many human faces over the course of his life. He wondered who was listening on the other end. Somewhere, a kid might be lying in bed in a cramped apartment, earbuds in, picturing the life as a thrilling alternative to their own frustration. Somewhere else, a middle-aged man might be shaking his head, thinking of cousins or brothers who had gone inside and never come out. Sammy knew he could not control how every listener took his words. All he could do was try to tilt the weight toward honesty, toward caution, toward the idea that the cost of that life was not worth the brief shine. As the podcast grew, so did the invitations. People wanted him at events, on panels, in documentaries. He had become, in his later years, something like a living museum exhibit, a relic of a fading era of organized crime who could still speak for himself. He chose carefully. His health was not what it once had been. Long travel days exhausted him. Crowds could be overwhelming. He preferred the studio, the controlled space where he could sit, breathe, and talk, then go home to his family and rest. Yet even in the quieter, more controlled present, the past remained a constant companion. Sometimes, mid-sentence, he would see a face from years ago and feel his throat tighten. A young man who had trusted him, an older man who had mentored him, a rival who had gone down, a victim whose name appeared only in court documents and memories. He did not always bring those names to the microphone. Some stories stayed locked in his mind, too raw or too private. The ones he did share carried enough shadows as it was. The public loved the calm crime tone. They called it soothing and unnerving all at once. The idea that a voice like his could lull people to sleep while describing the inner workings of a criminal empire said as much about the world as it did about him. Sammy understood the contradiction. He knew that his life was simultaneously a warning and a source of fascination. Old friends and old enemies might shake their heads at the sight of him behind a microphone instead of behind a table in a social club. Victims might grit their teeth at the sound of his name. In the end, he focused on what he could do. He could tell the truth as he remembered it. He could remind listeners that every glamorous story had a trail of pain behind it. He could, in small ways, use his remaining time to tilt a few minds away from the path he had taken. As the sun set on his days as a street boss and rose on his time as a storyteller, he found himself in a strange place. Not redeemed, not condemned beyond repair, simply alive, carrying a long, complicated history and speaking it into a world that preferred quick answers. There were no quick answers in his story, only long nights, hard choices, heavy consequences, and the distant possibility that some good might still come from laying it all bare. Chapter 10. Accounts with the Past. Late in life, the world narrows and widens at the same time. The physical space grows smaller. Doctor visits, short walks, familiar rooms. The energy for travel and adventure fades. Yet inside the mind, space opens wide. Memories stretch back over decades, filling the quiet with scenes from times and places long gone. For Sammy, those inner landscapes were crowded. Bensonhurst corners lit by flickering street lamps, the clammy halls of the school for incorrigibles, the warm, noisy chaos of Brooklyn social clubs, the polished floors of Manhattan courtrooms, the blinding Arizona sun, the muted greys of prison yards, the soft glow of podcast studios. All of it lived side by side in him. He woke early most days, not because he had to, but because sleep came in shorter bursts now. The first light of morning slipped through blinds, casting thin stripes on the wards. He would sit up slowly, joints protesting, and look around at the room that was his present. On a small table near his chair he kept a notebook. The cover was worn, the pages lined with his uneven handwriting. It was not a formal memoir and not quite a diary. It was a ledger of a different kind, one that kept track of thoughts instead of debts. He wrote down names when they came to him. There was the kid from the old neighborhood who had once shared a sandwich with him, and years later shared a prison tier. There was the older man who had called him son in none breath, and ordered hard things in the next. There were people he had hurt, directly and indirectly. Sometimes he wrote down short lines, helped his family when the landlord squeezed them, pulled him into business that finished badly, warned him not to do something. He did it anyway. I still feel it. These notes were not excuses. They were a way of mapping his own impact, for better and for worse, in a life that had moved many people like pieces on a board. The podcast had become a regular rhythm. Every week or so, he would sit in the studio, headphones on, microphone alive, and walk listeners through another corner of his past. Some episodes focused on the structure of the family, others on specific events, others still on broader themes: loyalty, fear, greed, survival. Outside the studio, his body reminded him that time does not negotiate. Climbs upstairs left him breathless. Old injuries ached more when the weather changed. Doctors spoke of medications and diets and numbers they wanted him to keep an eye on. He took it all in with the same attitude he had once brought to courtroom strategies. Listen, weigh, decide which moves still matter. One afternoon he sat alone at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee cooling by his hand. The house was quiet. Family would arrive later, for dinner or a visit, but for now it was just him and the hum of the refrigerator. He opened the notebook and stared at a blank page. After a minute he wrote 3 simple words. What was worth it? He let the question sit. The easy answer would have been nothing. Nothing was worth the harm, the prison years, the pain. But humans are rarely that simple, and he refused to lie even to himself. Some things he realized had been worth something, even amid the ruin. The loyalty he had once felt towards certain friends, even when it ended badly, had been real. The fierce desire to protect his family, even when expressed through dangerous means, had come from a true place. The discipline, the unwillingness to back down from responsibility, that had been part of his core from the start. What had not been worth it was the system that twisted those traits, the code that glorified silence over honesty, violence over compromise, dominance over compassion, the belief that power was an end in itself, the illusion that fear could replace respect. He thought again of loyalty. For most of his life, loyalty had meant putting the interests of the family above those of law, society, sometimes even blood relatives. Later it had twisted into frantic discussions about who had betrayed whom first. Now at this late stage the word shifted. Loyalty meant something quieter, showing up for grandkids' school events, taking phone calls from family at odd hours, being honest as much as he could with anyone who asked about his life, even when the answers made him look bad. He considered, often, the victims, not just the ones whose names appeared in charges and indictments, but the ripple victims. The kids who grew up with a father behind bars, the shop owners who lived under pressure, the workers on construction sites who lost wages when greed or corruption reconfigured contracts. They would never tune into his podcast looking for comfort. For many, the sound of his voice would inspire anger, not curiosity. He understood that. He did not expect forgiveness, and he knew that telling his story did not balance a scale drawn in blood and grief. Still, he felt a responsibility to speak plainly. If some young listener on the edge of the life heard his stories and decided that the cost was too high, that was something. Not everything. Not enough to erase what had been done, but something. In quiet moments, old New York came back to him in strange detail. The feel of a particular bar stool under his hands, the smell of wet wool coats in winter, the sound of envelopes being counted in the back room of a cafe, the way a particular boss cleared his throat before speaking, a tiny gesture that once made whole tables fall silent. He wondered, sometimes, what had become of certain streets. He knew roughly from news and from the accounts of people who still lived there. Neighborhoods had changed, old family names faded, new group operated under new rules. Some social clubs had become boutiques or restaurants. Others had been torn down and replaced with apartment buildings. The New York he carried in his head no longer existed anywhere except memories and recordings. The same was true of Arizona. The pool business, the ecstasy ring, the courtrooms there all belonged to another time. People still swam in the pools he had built, probably without knowing who had overseen the construction. Kids splashed in clear water, carefree, their laughter echoing off concrete and tile that had once been part of a hidden network of money and risk. Life moved on, as it always does, stepping over the marks left by past dramas. One evening, as the sky outside turned the soft color between day and night, he walked slowly from his bedroom to the small room where he kept a desk and a simple recording setup for when he did not want to travel to the main studio. The desk held a microphone, a modest mixer, and a laptop someone had set up for him with recording software. Next to the monitor sat the same notebook with the list of names and notes. He sat down with a sigh and ran a hand over his face. Today's episode, he had decided, would not be about a specific crime or a famous figure. It would be about the idea of being haunted, not by ghosts in sheets or shadows at the end of hallways, but by choices that echo for decades. He pressed the record button. A soft light came on. He spoke about the way certain moments replayed in his mind uninvited. The first time he had agreed to something he knew, deep down, crossed a line he could never uncross. The night he signed his name to cooperation papers. The afternoon he first sat with Arizona kids and offered advice on how to avoid getting caught. He talked about regret, not as a dramatic confession, but as a constant companion, a background hum in his life. He admitted that there were nights he slept fine and nights he woke up with his heart pounding for reasons he could not quite name. He told listeners that owning what he had done did not mean wallowing in it endlessly, nor did it mean shrugging it off. It meant acknowledging the harm and trying, in whatever small ways were left, to lean towards something better. As he spoke, he could feel a certain calm settle over him. Telling the truth had become, in his final years, the closest thing he had to a code. When the recording was done, he sat in silence for a moment. The room hummed. Outside, a car passed, its headlights drawing brief stripes on the wall. He turned off the microphone and leaned back. This, he thought, is a different kind of social club. No smoke, no cards, no envelopes spread on tables. Just a man, a microphone, and whoever is out there listening in the dark. He thought of the kid he had once been, standing on a Bensonhurst sidewalk, watching older men talk in low voices. If that kid could see him now, he might be confused. The power looked different. The stakes were quieter. There were no territory maps, no union charts, no crews waiting on orders. Yet in another way, nothing had changed. Words still moved people. Stories still carried weight. Choices still rippled outward. At the end of the night, he shut down the equipment and walked slowly through the hallway. Family photos lined the walls. Children and grandchildren frozen in moments of laughter. Graduation caps, birthday candles. He paused in front of one picture, fingers grazing the edge of the frame. He whispered, too softly for anyone else to hear, a small promise. To show up, to be present, to tell the truth even when it hurt, to spend whatever time remained trying, however imperfectly, to tilt the scales a little away from harm. In the bedroom, he sat on the edge of the bed and looked out at the night. There were no Brooklyn rooftops outside, no desert mountains, just a modest suburban skyline, a sprinkling of streetlights, a few trees. The sky, as always, was larger than his story. He lay back and closed his eyes. Some nights, sleep came quickly. Other nights, memories lined up like visitors, each waiting its turn. He had long since accepted that this was the cost of his particular life. For those listening to his voice as they drifted off in their own beds, he hoped for something simpler. Maybe they would take from his story the understand that no matter how exciting a criminal life might look from the outside, the bill always comes due. And maybe, just maybe, they would choose differently. He exhaled slowly, letting his mind empty, at least for a while. The underboss, the witness, the Arizona defendant, the storyteller. All different masks over the same person, all chapters in a book that was now, finally, reaching its last pages with a kind of quiet honesty he had never quite managed before.